It was just another average morning when I stepped outside, ready to enjoy a little peace before the chaos of my job as the city's chief inspector for construction took over. The sun was barely up, casting a soft glow over the suburban neighborhood. My coffee cup in hand, I scanned my surroundings, appreciating the calm of the day. That's when I saw her, Karen, the self-appointed sheriff of our HOA, standing by the edge of my yard with her clipboard. She was looking at my fence as if it had just offended her in some unimaginable way. I knew exactly what this was. Karen had never been shy about using her power as the HOA president to meddle in other people's business, and today, it seemed, my fence had drawn her attention. As I made my way over to her, I could already feel the tension building up. Karen didn't like the fact that I had built a privacy fence around my yard a few months ago. It was nothing extravagant, just a standard wooden fence, a few feet tall, designed to give me some peace and quiet. But apparently, it clashed with her vision of neat and tidy suburbia. "Sheriff, you really need to do something about this," Karen said, the sarcasm in her voice almost making my blood boil. She wasn't a sheriff, and I wasn't some neighbor who could be bullied into following her arbitrary rules. I was the chief inspector for the city's construction projects, and the thought that she could take my property from me just because she didn't like it was laughable. The nerve of her! The HOA didn't own the streets, the sidewalks, or my land. Yet here she was, waving her rulebook around, demanding that I tear down my fence. As if my work wasn't already difficult enough with all the ongoing construction projects across the city, now I had to deal with a neighbor who thought she could dictate the rules of my own home. I had built that fence within the city's construction codes and had even gotten the necessary permits. I wasn't going to let Karen take it down without a fight. I wasn't sure what bothered me more, the fact that she thought she could dictate how I used my property, or the smug expression on her face, as if she knew something I didn't. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. I could let this slide, avoid the confrontation, but I wasn't the kind of person who let people walk all over me. I worked too hard to get where I was, climbing up the ranks to become the chief inspector, to let some petty HOA president ruin my peace. I told her that I had the proper permits for the fence, and there was no legal reason for her to interfere. But Karen, with her usual flair for creating drama, dismissed it immediately. "You think the city's approval means anything?" she scoffed. "This is about the community. It doesn't fit in with the neighborhood aesthetic." I raised an eyebrow at her. Karen loved to talk about the neighborhood aesthetic, but if we're being honest, the only thing that really bothered her was anything that didn't meet her idea of what the neighborhood should look like. She had never once considered the fact that I might want privacy or that my fence was perfectly in line with the city's regulations. But of course, that didn't matter to Karen. In her world, she was the final authority on everything. I could feel my patience wearing thin, but I held it together. "Karen, I suggest you check with the city," I said calmly. "I've followed all the rules. This fence is up to code." She seemed to hesitate for a moment, clearly trying to figure out how to proceed. "I'll be calling the board," she said, her voice full of mock concern. "You'll regret this." Her words didn't faze me. I knew she liked to throw her weight around, but what she didn't know was that I could easily prove I was in the right. As a chief inspector, I had the entire city's building code on my side. There was no way Karen was going to be able to bully me into tearing down my fence. A few days passed, and I thought maybe Karen had finally let it go. But of course, that wasn't the case. The next thing I knew, I was receiving a formal notice from the HOA board. Karen had convinced them that my fence was a violation of some obscure aesthetic rule, despite the fact that there were no such violations in the city's regulations. The board's letter was long and full of legal jargon, but it was clear they were trying to force me into tearing down the fence, based solely on Karen's complaints. It was at that moment I knew I had to take action. I couldn't let her win, not just for my sake, but for every other person she had ever tried to push around in this neighborhood. Karen might have thought she had the upper hand, but I was the one with the power here. I had the law on my side, and I wasn't about to let her use her position to intimidate me. I spent the next few days preparing my case. I gathered every single document, every permit, every inspection report that proved my fence was built legally and according to the city's codes. I even went down to City Hall to make sure my records were in order double-checking everything. I knew this fight wasn't just about a fence. It was about standing up to Karen's abusive behavior and proving that no one, not even an HOA president, could override the law. As I prepared for the upcoming battle, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Karen was relentless, and she had a way of twisting everything to make it seem like she was in the right. But this time, it wasn't going to work. I was armed with facts, and I knew the rules better than anyone. The HOA board may have been swayed by her drama, but they hadn't bothered to check the facts. I, on the other hand, had spent years in construction, inspecting projects and making sure they adhered to the law. I wasn't about to let a petty HOA dispute ruin my peace or my property. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I was ready. I showed up with my stack of documents, permits, blueprints, city codes, and inspection reports. I knew this wasn't just about my fence anymore. It was about setting a precedent. If Karen could get away with something like this, it would be a green light for every other power-hungry HOA president in the city to start pushing their weight around. I wasn't going to let that happen. When I walked into the meeting, Karen was already there, sitting smugly at the head of the table, as if she were the queen of the neighborhood. She shot me a glance, her lips curling into a fake smile. "Ah, Sheriff," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "I see you're here to finally admit your mistake." Her words were meant to provoke me, but I wasn't taking the bait. I simply set my documents on the table, ready to lay out my case. The board members looked around nervously, unsure of how to proceed. They had clearly been swayed by Karen's convincing arguments, but I could see the doubt creeping into their faces now that I was presenting the hard facts. I started with the permits, how they had been properly filed and approved. I showed the blueprints, proving that the fence had been constructed to city standards. The inspector reports confirmed everything was done according to the law. I even pulled up the city's construction code, highlighting the sections that directly supported my case. Karen, of course, tried to interrupt every now and then, but I kept my cool. I wasn't here to argue with her. I was here to educate the board on what the law actually said. I could see Karen's face turning red as she realized she wasn't going to win this with her usual theatrics. She tried to dismiss my evidence, but it was clear the board members were starting to question her authority. They weren't used to someone standing up to her, and it made them uncomfortable. Just as I thought things might be turning in my favor, Karen pulled out her trump card. She claimed that my fence was an eyesore and was ruining the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I could hear the collective sighs of the board members. This was the argument that had always worked for her in the past, but this time it fell flat. I stood up and addressed the board directly. "You can't take my property just because it doesn't fit someone's idea of beauty. The law doesn't work that way," I said, my voice firm. The city approved this, and I followed all the rules. If Karen has a problem with that, she should take it up with the city, not with me. There was a moment of silence in the room. I could feel the tension rising. Karen's smug expression faltered slightly, but she wasn't giving up without a fight. She tried to change the subject, claiming that my fence was violating HOA rules on property lines. But I was ready for that too. I had double-checked the property boundaries with the city's records, and I knew there was no violation. I pulled up the map on my phone, showing the exact lines and confirming that my fence was well within my property. At this point, the board members started whispering among themselves. I could see them reevaluating the situation, realizing that Karen had overplayed her hand. They didn't want to go against the law, and they didn't want to lose face in front of the community. After what felt like an eternity, the board president cleared his throat and addressed Karen. "It seems, Karen, that the city's approval is final here," he said, his voice hesitant. "We can't override city codes based on personal preferences." I couldn't help but smile. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The board had finally seen the light. Karen's face went pale. She wasn't used to being questioned, and she certainly wasn't used to losing. She tried to argue one last time, but it was clear she was out of options. The board voted, and it was unanimous. My fence was staying. Karen had lost. As I left the meeting, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I knew that this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been bullied by HOA rules. It was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could just trample on people's rights without consequences. Karen had learned that lesson the hard way, and I was glad to be the one to teach it to her. But the story didn't end there. The next morning, as I was sipping my coffee and enjoying the peace of my yard, I saw Karen standing at the end of the street, staring at my fence. She was seething with anger, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. I had won, and there was nothing she could do about it. Or so I thought. The next day, Karen showed up at my doorstep. I had a feeling it was far from over, despite the legal victory. She wasn't the type to just walk away from a loss. She'd always come back for round two. As I opened the door, I could see her standing there, clutching a new stack of papers. This time, however, her expression was different. It wasn't the usual smug, triumphant grin that I'd grown used to. It was more like a mix of frustration and disbelief. She was clearly plotting her next move. "Sheriff," she started, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I hope you're happy with yourself. You've won this round, but I'm not done yet." She shoved the papers into my hands. "These are violation notices from the HOA board," she said, "and it seems they were issued before you got your permits. That means your fence might still be a violation after all. I suggest you start preparing to take it down." I glanced at the papers, but something didn't feel right. These violation notices were dated before the construction of the fence, which meant they had been issued before the city's approval. It was clear that Karen had been keeping tabs on me even before the fence was built. The timing was too perfect, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of game she was playing now. I didn't let her see how unsettling the situation was. I looked at her calmly and said, "Karen, I've already shown the board and the city that my fence complies with all regulations. You can keep trying, but you're just wasting your time. And if you keep harassing me, I'll have no choice but to take legal action." Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw the real Karen behind the mask of professionalism. She wasn't used to losing control, and now that she had, she was determined to regain it. "You think I'm wasting my time?" she scoffed. "I've already contacted the board again, and they're not backing down. You'll see. This is just the beginning." I slammed the door shut before she could say anything else. I had enough of her empty threats. But as I stood there, I realized that Karen wasn't the only one I had to worry about. The HOA board members had already proven that they could be easily swayed by her, and I wasn't sure if they would stand firm this time. Karen might have been defeated in the meeting, but it seemed like she wasn't ready to admit defeat. She would go to any lengths to get what she wanted. That afternoon, I made a call to one of my colleagues at the city office. I explained the situation, and he agreed to help me by digging into Karen's history with the HOA. It was clear that this wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about Karen's obsession with control and her need to prove she was always right. I needed to know if there was more to her than just being an HOA president. And if there was, I was going to expose it. While I waited for the investigation to unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was getting desperate. Later that week, as I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, I saw a strange sight. A group of workers were on my property, standing by the fence, taking pictures and talking among themselves. At first, I thought maybe they were city inspectors, but as I got closer, I realized they were from a construction company, one that I didn't recognize. I approached them cautiously. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. One of the workers, a man with a clipboard, turned to me with a sheepish look. "We've been hired to remove the fence," he said, almost apologetically. "The HOA sent us here. It's a court order." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A court order? I hadn't received anything like that. This was the moment I realized that Karen wasn't just playing petty games anymore. She had escalated things to a dangerous level. She had somehow convinced the HOA to get the construction company involved, and now they were trying to tear down my fence without any legal backing. I immediately pulled out my phone and started recording. This wasn't happening. Not on my watch. I marched up to the workers, my anger boiling over. "You're not doing anything until I get some answers," I told them. "Where's the court order? Where's the proper documentation?" The worker looked flustered. "We were just given instructions," he said, "when not involved in the paperwork." I was done with this. I marched straight to the company's office, armed with my documentation proving that my fence was built to code and legally approved. The more I dug into it, the more I realized just how far Karen was willing to go. The construction company had no legal claim to my property. This was all an attempt to force me into submission, and I wasn't going to let her win. As I returned home, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my colleague at the city office. He had found something interesting about Karen. It turns out that Karen had been involved in several shady dealings with the HOA in the past, including pressuring contractors for personal gain. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This wasn't just about a fence. It was about a pattern of corruption that had been going on for years, and I was going to make sure it ended now. With this new information in hand, I felt a renewed sense of determination. I wasn't going to let Karen and the HOA continue their reign of terror over my neighborhood. The fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about exposing corruption and standing up for what was right. The following morning, I woke up with a plan. I wasn't going to wait for Karen to make her next move. I needed to take control of the situation once and for all. Armed with the new information about Karen's past and her shady dealings, I decided to take action. My first step was to confront the HOA board directly and make sure they knew exactly who they were dealing with. I wasn't just a homeowner being bullied by a power-hungry neighbor. I was the city's chief inspector for construction, and I had the law on my side. The board needed to understand that this wasn't just a petty neighborhood dispute. It was about corruption and abuse of power. I called for a special meeting with the HOA board, explaining the situation and the facts I had uncovered. The board agreed, but I knew I had to be careful. Karen had a way of spinning things in her favor, and I wasn't about to let her manipulate the situation again. I gathered all the documents, Karen's past violations, the company records, the photos of my fence, and the legal documentation proving my fence was built to code. I was going to make sure the board saw her for what she truly was, someone willing to break the law to get her way. When I arrived at the meeting, the board members were already seated, their faces a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. Karen was there, of course, sitting with her usual smug look, as if she already knew she had the situation under control. But this time, I wasn't going to let her control the narrative. I started by presenting the facts about my fence, how it had been approved by the city, how all the necessary permits had been filed, and how it met the construction codes. I showed the board the legal documents, proving that everything had been done by the book. Then, I moved on to Karen. I opened the binder my colleague had put together, showing the board all of Karen's past violations. There were records of her pressuring contractors to do work on her personal property under the guise of HOA improvements. There were multiple instances where she had bullied other homeowners into making changes to their property that violated city codes, and she had covered it up by claiming she was acting in the best interest of the community. The board members looked stunned. They had no idea Karen had been involved in these kinds of shady dealings. I didn't stop there. I pulled up the construction company's records and showed them the communication between Karen and the contractors she had hired to remove my fence. It was clear that she had orchestrated the entire thing, and there was no legal backing for the removal. The company had been hired without a court order or any proper documentation, making their involvement in the destruction of my fence illegal. I could see the board members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they had been manipulated by Karen's lies and false accusations. Karen, however, wasn't backing down. She tried to interrupt me, but this time, her usual confidence had faded. She stammered, tried to explain away the records I had just presented, but her voice lacked conviction. The more she spoke, the more the board members began to question her integrity. It was clear to me now that Karen had lost control of the situation. Her web of lies was beginning to unravel, and there was no way she could talk her way out of it. Finally, the board president spoke up. "Karen, we've reviewed the evidence, and it seems you've misrepresented several facts," he said, his tone firm. "We can't allow this to continue. The city has already approved the fence, and there's no basis for its removal." He turned to me. "Sheriff, we apologize for the confusion. We'll make sure this issue is resolved and that Karen's actions are thoroughly investigated." Karen's face turned beet red, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She couldn't believe what was happening. She had always been in control, always been able to bend the HOA board to her will, but now she was the one being exposed. The board members looked at her with a mixture of disappointment and anger, and I could see the realization dawning on her. She had lost. This time, there was no way she could get out of it. But even as Karen was being confronted with the consequences of her actions, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The next step was to make sure that the other homeowners in the neighborhood knew what had been going on. Karen had bullied so many people into silence over the years, and now it was time for her to face the truth. I contacted a few neighbors I trusted and shared the information I had uncovered about Karen's actions. As I expected, they were shocked. But more than that, they were angry. They had all suffered in silence, too afraid to speak up for fear of retribution from Karen and her clique of board members. Over the next few days, word spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to stand up to Karen now felt empowered to speak out. They shared their own stories of how she had intimidated them, how she had used her position to push them around and make unreasonable demands. One by one, more people came forward, telling their stories and exposing the truth about Karen's reign of terror. It was clear that Karen's time as HOA president was coming to an end. The community was no longer going to allow her to bully them. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Karen tried to hold on to her position, but the HOA board could no longer ignore the overwhelming evidence against her. They called for a vote to remove her from her position as president, and when the vote was finally held, it was unanimous. Karen was out. She tried to fight it, but the support for her removal was too strong. It was a victory for the entire neighborhood, but most importantly, it was a victory for everyone who had been pushed around by Karen's abuse of power. With Karen gone, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA leadership was more focused on community well-being than on enforcing petty rules. People were starting to feel comfortable again, knowing they no longer had to live in fear of unreasonable fines and rules. My fence, which had once been the center of the dispute, became a symbol of what could happen when people stood up for their rights. Karen, meanwhile, disappeared from the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that she had moved to a different part of the city, but her reputation had followed her. No one would trust her again. And as for me, well, I had proven that even someone in a position of power like Karen couldn't get away with breaking the law. The city had taken notice of my actions, and I was starting to gain a reputation as someone who would fight for what was right. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about making sure that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could push people around without consequences.